So we're going to continue, and the next one, interestingly enough, we're going to pick up on one of the topics we just discussed, which is NFTs. And I'm going to invite my good friend, Rhian Lewis, author and all-around great person on NFTs. Thank you for having us.
Lovely to see you.
Super good to have you here. Appreciate it. Good. So, Rhian, let me go to my cheat sheet. And we'll talk NFTs and efficiency. So we've done a little bit of prep. So just as a start, so a brief start on NFTs and where they came from and how they came to where they are now.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question and a really important one to set out, I think, at the beginning, so that when we get halfway through, we don't have anyone in the audience thinking, wow, I can do all that with my Bored Ape NFT, because, of course, NFTs are not JPEGs. And to go back a little bit in history, although we think of NFTs as being something that have evolved just over the last few years, the first NFTs were actually invented 10 years ago. The very first NFTs were on Bitcoin with something called colored coins, which was described at the time as writing in the margins of Bitcoin. But Bitcoin does not have very wide margins. It does one thing incredibly well, but it took until we had smart contract-enabled blockchains in the form of Ethereum to be able to have these tokens to which you can attach a lot more data. Because this distinction between fungible and non-fungible, people get hung up on. But essentially what it is if you have 0.1 Bitcoin, 0.1 ETH, it's pretty much like, with a few exceptions, interchangeable, just like a £10 note is interchangeable for another pound note. But these non-fungible tokens came about because the data that was attached to them allowed them to signify uniqueness. You could have serial numbers, you could have pointers to a specific other asset that lived somewhere else. So they conferred this uniqueness on whatever they're attached to. So when we talk about a non-fungible token, we're not just talking about Ethereum standard ERC-721. We're talking about a piece of data, a record on a blockchain.
Right. So one example I really like is like general things in the world are non-fungible, right? Your dog is your dog. I can have, maybe a cabbage and exchange that to your dog, and you can't walk the cabbage, but the dog is the dog, right? And that's one of the aspects. So thinking about now financial services, you were talking about NFTs, and Guillaume just said that, NFTs are not JPEGs and stuff like that. So looking to the business processes in financial services, what exactly NFTs could help unlock in terms of efficiencies?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because I think we can look at this in a twofold kind of way. There's the idea of creating markets for things which don't currently have markets or don't have liquid markets in any case. And there's the idea of just improving markets for assets, maybe non-fungible real-world assets. So let's take these one step at a time. So, and then we've got the tooling around that as well, which is another interesting area. So if we talk about the sort of markets that we could create using NFTs that don't currently exist, you can look at things like digital assets in the metaverse or gaming or whatever. I just sort of touch on that because Outlier Ventures' MetaFi thesis allows you to think about financialization of things that aren't currently financialized. That's one area that's really interesting. Another area is you could have something like, you could be somebody who maybe is interested in prediction markets. You could turn your bets into NFTs and have a secondary market for that kind of thing.
Look at that.
Or you could use something like the ERC 1155 standard to bundle all sorts of different things and have a market for that. So that's, if you like, thinking about things that aren't currently served by current markets. But I think the really cool stuff, the magic starts to happen. And that line about cabbages and dogs is actually really cool, because I was just going to talk about something really dull, like apartments not being fungible or something like that, but maybe the dog and the cabbage is more memorable. The magic really comes about when you can start tokenizing real-world assets and bringing this natively global, natively digital approach to being able to trade things that normally only have a very small and limited market. So one really accessible way to think about this, I'll use two examples. One's real estate, which I'll come to in a minute, and the other one is fashion, because recently, we've seen a lot of really big names in the fashion world moving into NFTs, not just as digital wearables, but quite often as physical twins, where an NFT represents a physical garment. And this is already a financial market of sorts, in that people buy these vintage Christian Dior pieces as investment pieces. So they're looking to the future. And the reason that Dolce & Gabbana, Hermes, Tiffany are all getting into this market, it's not, as some cynics have suggested, because they're making a quick buck. And cashing in on the whole kind of NFT phenomenon. It's because these are the fashion vintage collectibles of the future. And quick disclaimer, I work for a company called Boson Protocol, and that's specifically what we're doing, is tokenizing real-world assets as NFTs. So I think quite a lot about this stuff, and I think this potential is really, really interesting. In terms of real estate, also a really interesting idea, because real estate is cumbersome, we all know that, and also very, very expensive. But NFTs are kind of weird, because you can actually take something that's non-fungible and turn it into something fungible by fractionalizing it. So you could have something like people trading fractions of a property which started out as an NFT, and then maybe hedging that by having an NFT of a property in a completely different market, maybe commercial property in another country, fractionalizing that, creating a basket of these investments. And you're talking about taking a market that was very, very illiquid and turning it into something that, because of the native interoperability that token standards bring, turning it into something that is immediately very, very liquid. And then I think the third thing is just this tooling, which I think we'll probably talk about in a little bit more detail. Things like credentials, disclosure NFTs, notarizing, all these different things that you can actually use NFTs as tools for making your processes more efficient.
Yeah, I want to go into that, because you touched on real estate, and there's the whole mortgage process, which usually is a pain for whoever is taking on the mortgage. There's many errors within a financial institution handling documentation, going back and forth. There's sometimes a notary involved, and all of that goes through reams of paper and back and forth and signatures and all of that. And it's a massive workflow, and it's done multiple times every day, because there's a bunch of mortgages everywhere in the world. And playing the role of like the conduit of a mortgage, do you think that there's space for NFTs to become this big notarizer that is decentralized and that everyone can add to it as the process goes along? How do you see that playing in terms of being the tool that actually facilitates even internal processes, if you will?
Yeah, I think this is super important, and a lot of people get hung up on the idea that it's somehow putting notaries out of work, but I see it more as maybe they take on a more advisory role, or a role perhaps in a small community of being the person who helps validate your identity or something like that. Whereas the notarization process is templated according to the local rules and so on. But this notarization process that goes on could be made that much easier by, say, for example, the really simple thing of having mortgage approval. Well, that's been in the news all of this week for obvious reasons. A lot of people's approvals expired and they could only then mortgage at a much higher rate. Well, it doesn't solve that problem, but it takes away a lot of the cumbersome admin if you had something like a credential in your wallet that could say, that was an NFT, that could say you'd been pre-approved. And that's a really good example of how NFTs can be used as just a type of data wrapper for structured information. And a lot of people in the room are probably going to think, well, you could just use a database for that. But it's this idea that it's on-chain, that it's universal, that anyone can look at it and see that you've been approved. It's just quite an interesting, one interesting idea anyway.
Yeah. I like the whole concept of having a long-term history of everything someone did on the wallet, and obviously the wallet shows the corresponding assets, and those assets tell a story. One particular use case I'm seeing, especially in crypto conferences, is the POAP, which is the Proof of Attendance Protocol, which is an NFT that the organizers can issue to the participating wallets, and you can carry that as like a badge of honor or a I've been there style claim, right? We have a couple of questions here. Let me see. Are you concerned about the fractionalizing real world assets and therefore turning them into securities? Then there's also, let me see, real world assets, turning them into securities may cause bubbles that are not justified by real world fundamentals. Again, with real estate, how you just start attack and change the land registry, will the government ever let go? So let's go with the fractionalization first. And these two questions maybe come together. One is fractionalizing real world assets and therefore turning them into securities, and then by fractionalizing them, they maybe disconnect their value from the underlying asset. So is there any particular implications of when you turn something that is illiquid or less liquid into something more liquid, you would incentivize some additional form of speculation, therefore increase volatility on that particular fraction of the asset?
This is true, and this is a concern. But at the same time, there are many other processes and things that happen in the real world that cause this to happen. So taking that in parallel with the second question about bubbles, we've obviously seen this absolutely massive overvaluation, well, I know it's subjective, but unaffordable housing in many cities and many countries around the world that has already happened, but not for these reasons. Yes, I'm going to go back to something that Matt Hancock said this morning, actually, who was making the point that it's going to happen anyway, but where does it happen? So the question is that you either let this happen in a regulated and sensible way in your own jurisdiction, or you find people in other jurisdictions turning assets in your jurisdiction into a bubble. It's a really interesting point. And by saying that this is a possibility, I'm not necessarily endorsing it or say I think it's an amazing thing, but I do see it as quite an inevitable thing in many ways.
Yeah, every time we make something more liquid, I mean, we're probably bound to, okay, then there's more people to which this is now affordable, so we can now do a little bit more arbitrage between who can afford and who cannot, and maybe create those additional layers of opportunity will require us to be a little bit more strict, and maybe in terms of suitability as well. So that is certainly something that regulators could also help frame in terms of what is the role of a tokenization entity in ensuring that the market stays level and fair. So
exactly, and the corollary to that, of course, is also that somebody who cannot afford a home can afford to invest via fractionalization and benefit from the market. But I do see these things as examples of where people have to work hand in hand with regulators to prevent these things from happening.
Yeah. Good. Let's tackle the other one with the land registry. So the question is, real estate, but how would you start to tackle and change the land registry? Will the government ever let go? So I think that's a big question for governments, but in general, if you're more efficient as an entity, and I understand the public service might not always be striving for efficiency, but if you're in a better position to handle the data that you're responsible for, it should be an incentive to actually tackle that in a way that is decentralized, at least using a decentralized infrastructure, right?
Precisely, and bizarrely, and we didn't plan this question, but among the variety of different things that I do, I'm a back-end software engineer. One of the projects I actually worked on 18 months ago was the government's new planning system. So in the course of that, I talked to lots of people from the planning department and read lots of stuff, and the land registry has already gone down the route of not NFTs per se, but blockchain-based transactions. In fact, the land registry have done their first ever blockchain transaction, which was about 14 months ago using Corda. So I don't think it's a question really of the land registry letting go, but of integrations on a permissioned basis with existing systems.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, then we go back to the crypto, blockchain, not crypto style discussion, but not this time. Another interesting question is there such a thing as a celebrity touch in NFTs? For example, a premium for an art piece that David Beckham used to own. That was very specific. I don't know who asked this, but that was very specific. I hope you have a David Beckham formerly owned NFT, if that's the case. But do you think that there's now that is, the data is accessible and provable?
100%. So let's divide that into digital assets and real-world assets. An example of this happening right in front of us is Snoop Dogg and his mansion in the Sandbox. And for people who don't know about the Sandbox, I don't actually own sand tokens, I promise I'm not shilling, but it's a metaverse where you can buy land, start businesses, display your NFTs. And the mansions and land parcels around Snoop's mansion are vastly more expensive than any of the parcels of land anywhere else, just because of the celebrity effect. But yes, I mean, in vintage fashion, you only have to look at things like recently the dress which Marilyn Monroe used to sing Happy Birthday to President Kennedy. That's like historic. But anything that's been owned or worn by a celebrity, Jimi Hendrix's guitar, anything like that, if that were to be twinned with an NFT, then yes, the celebrity magic dust would rub off on that. And I think there's definitely an effect.
With the difference that when it's on chain, you have clear provable provenance. When it's in the real world without any backing, how do you know? I mean, I could just, as easily maybe create a guitar that has the same dents and the runouts of the Hendrix guitar, and then maybe sell it. It's not true. But if I can have the digital twin and the provenance on an NFT that gives me the credentials of that instrument, that might be even more enticing for a real fan to buy.
Precisely,
right?
And obviously linking NFTs to physical assets is hard. It's a hard thing. But then what's starting to, the infrastructure around this is just starting to spring up, and you're talking about custody solutions, for example, where provenance is validated by the fact that the item is in custody and then signified with this NFT receipt.
Yeah, good. So the last one is musicians can get paid what they deserve for their streams with NFT. That's debatable. The problem is, why would anyone stop using products that are cheap and work well? For example, Spotify.
Well, This is a great question, because isn't it just the Web 2 versus Web 3 debate with one example? We're used to frictionless experiences online, because that's what Web 2 has brought us. It's undeniable that with UX, the way it is in current Web3 solutions, it does introduce friction which people aren't necessarily used to, and which people will do anything like opting for centralized sources to get out of that friction experience. But the question is it something that's going to be worth it to somebody? It's a cultural shift, but also a supply-side shift, because the UX has to massively improve, I think.
And I think past the UX, I think one of the things that we've learned from Bitcoin is that we're driven by incentives. So we'll probably have to introduce a little bit of a different incentive dynamic in the music industry to actually switch from that point on. So my provocation would be, what if NFTs worked as CDs that actually got you paid to listen to them? Right? So that is something that can be maybe incentivized. So with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much, Rhian. That was a pleasure to have you here. And we're going